criminal behavior is we tend to now look at psychopaths as people who are willing to do violence or be dangerous, who don't care about lives and society, whereas sociopaths, the prevailing or dominant trait is a lack of remorse or caring. It's a psychopath goes on a killer spree. A sociopath works on Wall Street in 2008. And so, you don't have to go around killing people and dismembering them and all these other horrible things if you're a sociopath. You could just be someone who has very little remorse. I treated a number of sociopaths both when I was working at the psychiatric hospital and here in my practice. There are one or two sociopaths in Hollywood. Big surprise. But I remember so clearly one that I treated early in my career where a guy came in, a young man, about 28, 29, who wore dark glasses, never took them off. And I said, why are you here? He said, well, I got drunk a couple months ago and I was driving and I hit this woman and she's paralyzed for life. And I said, my God, how did that make you feel? He said, well, it made me feel I better get my drinking under control. I could have been killed.
Oh, geez.
That's a sociopath. Right? I knew at that moment I was talking to a sociopath.
Absolutely.
In my latest Rinaldi novel, Head Wounds, which just came out a couple months ago, is the first time I've actually depicted a psychopath in truly classic form. And it was very exciting to do. I'd never had written one before because I often think in crime literature, it's too easy just to go, well, the guy's crazy. And, I see that a lot on television shows, where, but also in crime fiction, in prose, where the author takes the easy way out and just says, well, the guy's crazy. He's going around killing people because he doesn't like the color yellow. That's not why people do what they do. And in Head Wounds, the other thing that's kind of interesting, I've written 5 of these Rinaldi novels, and they are technically thrillers, but they always have a whodunit aspect to it. The reader doesn't know who the bad guy is usually till the end. In Head Wounds, I do something different. I tell the reader right up front who the bad guy is. And so it becomes a cat and mouse game between Daniel Rinaldi and this extraordinarily brilliant, devious, and dangerous psychopath. And it was really interesting to write because this guy's pretty bad. And so I got to go to all my dark places, which is one of the fun things about writing psychological suspense.
We enjoy reading them too. We tend to like the darker books.
Yeah, well, I don't know about you, but when I read Gone Girl, I thought to myself, if I'm Gillian Flynn's husband, I'm sleeping with one eye.
Oh, definitely.
In your Daniel Rinaldi series, Danny teams up with the Pittsburgh police, as we've already discussed. How do you research the police procedural part of your books?
Well, a couple ways. Number one, I've known for many years a former LAPD homicide detective, and he's been a great help. I also just have read and researched a lot. Some of the research, it runs the gamut from, reading crime scene case studies to watching Law and Order. I mean, you can run the whole gamut, getting ideas. One of the things I pride myself on is not only getting the clinical and psychological aspects of the mental health profession correct, is also to have a fairly accurate representation of what happens with law enforcement. The only difference is, and this is something that every crime writer does, whether on film, TV, or in books, is we have the police working on one case, maybe 2 in each book. And that's actually not the situation. They're working 4 or 5 or 8 cases, sometimes a dozen at a time. You never see Harry Bosch working on more than one case at a time. And that's Michael Connelly knows damn well that's not the way it works. The reader can't follow 12 cases. And
true.
So
that's why, very true.
But like I said, I try to make the book as accurate as I can about the police work, absolutely accurate about the state of the mental health profession, the good and the bad about the mental health profession right now. In fact, in the first book, Mirror Image, the 2 main settings are a very high-end, expensive private psychiatric facility, like the one at which I interned, and county facility in Pittsburgh. And the vast differences in the resources and the way the patients are treated, and how America has really dropped the ball when it comes to mental health treatment.
That's very true.
Yeah.
That's sad.
Yes, it is. Young Robbie Palermo comes up with the term head wounds. Can you describe how that term is defined in the book?
I've always liked the phrase head wounds because it's so creepy and, weird. And, he suffered a head wound. And as a therapist, I thought to myself, well, what is psychic pain if not a head wound? A wound in your head. And when I used to play video games with my son, who's now 22 and off at school. When I used to play video games with him, sometimes to kill the aliens, you would need like a head wound. It would go, head wound, alien down. And you get
right.
I thought to myself, what a great metaphor for psychic pain, for emotional pain. And that's where I got the idea that when Robbie Palermo, the young boy whose best friend commits suicide, the boy, Robbie, doesn't know how to make sense of it. And so when he and Dr. Rinaldi come to an understanding that it's like the video games he and his late friend used to play, that his late friend had a wound in his head. And that's where I got the idea.
So going back to Pittsburgh and Baltimore kind of having similar backgrounds, you mentioned in Head Wounds that Pittsburgh is a popular city for filming. And Baltimore also, like you said, Homicide, Life on the Streets was filmed here in Baltimore. So what about these cities do you think is desirable in filmmaking?
Well, I think, first of all, the visual qualities. Here in Los Angeles, everything looks the same. Everything is flat and warm and bright, and it's a bunch of mini malls. The thing that Baltimore or Detroit or Pittsburgh and certainly New York give you is an urban core that gives you light and dark, that gives you poverty and riches, that gives you a kind of heft. If you think of the wonderful film noir movies of the 30s, 40s, and 50s, the city was like this urban jungle. You don't imagine that if you ever go out to like Arizona or Montana. There's no urban jungle there. And I think that these eastern cities also are going through a big transition, whether it's Boston, New York, Pittsburgh, Baltimore, Cleveland, and it's a real slam of the old and new coming together. And the tension, in Pittsburgh, certainly, the tension between the city fathers who want the city to be as modern and attractive to industry and to convention goers as possible, and people who've lived in the same house in East Liberty for 2 generations or 3 generations who literally are getting priced out of where they live. Places are getting gentrified. So there's a real tension between the blue collar and the white collar. In Pittsburgh, and I'm sure this is true in Baltimore, if your grandfather was a mill worker, your dad was a mill worker, you could be pretty sure that you would be able to get a job as a mill worker. Well, that's not true anymore.
This is true.
So you either have to go to college or you have to go somewhere else.
Right.
And so the generational thing that has made cities like Pittsburgh so tight and so familial and so communal, where generation after generation worked in the same plant, that's gone. And so a city is undergoing a transformation where it doesn't even know what its identity is yet. I think one of the reasons everyone likes the Steelers, and God knows I'm a big Steeler fan, is they feel like the old Pittsburgh. They're muscular and violent and, all the good stuff. As Billy Wilder said one time, all the things that make life worth living. And the Steelers represent that old Pittsburgh spirit. And so I think that's why people like it. All these eastern cities give you so much visual dynamic because of the contrast. The old buildings, the nature, all that stuff. I remember when I saw the Denzel Washington film Unstoppable, shot in Pennsylvania and in Pittsburgh and environs. You see cobblestone streets and you see hills with big trees on them and you see a bunch of guys, scarves on and train engineer hats on, and they still look like that. Not many other places. They don't look like that in Phoenix. Yeah. They don't look like that in San Francisco. They don't look like that in LA. And I think that's why these cities are so attractive to filmmakers.
Well, I think also Baltimore and Pittsburgh in particular are very bohemian cities. In Baltimore, there's a huge arts, especially a resurgence here, and I know that Pittsburgh has the same thing. There's a lot going on there in the art world.
That's true. That one of the things that's so surprising when people come to Pittsburgh is what a vital artistic community that it has. It also has a rich tradition in terms of the art. In one of my novels, I just list like about 20 famous jazz artists who came from Pittsburgh, let alone movie stars like Gene Kelly and Shirley Jones and composers like Henry Mancini. I mean, the list goes on and on and on of wonderful artists who either made their home in Pittsburgh or grew up in Pittsburgh. So there's a very vibrant artistic community there. I mean, if you think of Carnegie Mellon, for example, in the 70s, all the guys that came out of Carnegie Mellon came out here to Hollywood. Steve Bochco and all those. That's where L.A. Law and Hill Street Blues and all those shows from the 70s and 80s, half of them were written by Carnegie Mellon graduates because Bochco kept calling all of his friends who had been in school with him and said, come on out here and let's make television.
Oh, wow.
All these shows we remember, half of them were written by Carnegie Mellon graduates.
Well, do you see any plans to make the Daniel Rinaldi series into a movie or TV?
Well, I can't say much, but there are plans afoot. We're seeking to develop it as a TV series.
Oh, I'm excited.
Well, the thing is, you have to remember about Hollywood. Sounds good, but this is the first step in a 1,000-mile journey where you can trip at any point. There's some promising noises in the wind, is the most I'll say. I'm from the old...
Will you be writing the script?
Oh, no. No. I'm too old. Hollywood does not want a 67-year-old grizzled guy like me writing television for them. Oh. And also, frankly, to be honest, I think my value to my patients who are primarily in the industry, my value to them is that I'm not in competition with them in any way. I think it makes the work cleaner. And so as a result, if we're lucky enough to get a series going, I'm basically an innocent bystander. It's essentially just going to say based on novels by Dennis Palumbo, and that'll be the end of that. Other than that, go with God. I just hope they do a good job. If we get a chance to go forward, I hope it represents the book as well as they can be represented, though I always think that Ernest Hemingway had the best response. When asked about Hollywood and his novels, he said, well, what you do is you go up to the California border. They throw you money, you throw them the book, and then you both go in opposite directions. And so I can tell you that as the author of these books, once the rights are sold or once they decide to develop it and move forward, the author is kind of a necessary evil. They'd like to have as little to do with you as possible.
Oh.
Well, maybe you could at least be a technical advisor.
Well, that's what I figure. If there ever was a series, I'd probably try to be a consultant. I spent 5 years studying with the nation's #1 trauma expert, Bob Stollerow. And since Daniel Rinaldi is a trauma expert, I mean, his official job is he treats the victims of violent crime, people who've been robbed or sexually assaulted or been in a kidnapping or something, and they've survived it, but they still have all the PTSD symptoms that such a trauma would evoke in you. And my work with Robert Stollerow over the years has allowed me to write about the trauma of victims. And one of the things that I think, I'm going to pat myself on the back here, so bear with me. One of the things I think that's nice about my books is that most crime novels, we don't spend much time on the victim. We mostly are just going, wow, what a terrible crime, and now let's go get the bad guy. I like to concentrate on the surviving victims sometimes and what their experience is like. If you've been carjacked, you may not want to drive anymore. I had a patient who was mugged and raped in a parking garage, and it took years and years and years before she was willing to pull her car into a parking garage again. I think that what I try to do in my novels is give the experience, while they're thrilling and they have twists and turns and terrifying villains, I do try to also spend some time talking about the experience of this on the victims and how traumatic it is. If you think about it, we live in an age of trauma. We've got terrorism, we've got economic problems, we've got tsunamis and earthquakes and hurricanes. People are quite traumatized by daily life right now. And so I think the fact that I get to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, what the symptoms are like when you're traumatized, how that can be treated, all that stuff is filtered against the background of a suspenseful novel. My goal is always to make it a page-turner that at the end of which you were not only thrilled, but you came away with a better understanding of some psychological topic or sociological issue.
I think that comes through very well. I think it's very important. You mentioned PTSD theorizing all the shame that military people will feel. They don't want to go to therapists. They think, well, I should just be able to deal with this. But I think it's important to let people know that there is no shame in this. You have to deal with it. They need help.
Of course. I mean, my God, the suicide rate among returning veterans is staggering right now.
Yes.
Oh, it's terrible.
First of all, from Vietnam, more people died after Vietnam from suicide or OD than died in Vietnam. And we are approaching that same issue right now with the people who are deployed in the Middle East.
Yes.
Yes, definitely. Unfortunately.
Well, there's still a pretty big stigma